Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to the special edition of News in Focus. My name is Fahraaz Patel. I'd like to thank you, the viewer, for staying with us here on Hilaal TV, DSTV channel 347. Now, of course, the local government elections, another important form of exercising our democracy, will take place next year. And you've heard, of course, from the IEC Chief Electoral Officer, Simon Mabolo, saying that, of course, the period between November 2026 and January 2027 will be the time for this local government elections to happen. So joining me now, I'd like to welcome the Deputy CEO of the Electoral Operations at the Independent Electoral Commission, Mr. Masego Sheburi, just to break down, of course, looking ahead to the local government elections. And of course, just a year ago, we had the national and provincial elections. Masego, good day. Thank you so much for making the time for us here on News in Focus on Hilaal TV.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam. Masego, I think when we look at last year's elections, I think more political parties, more voter turnout, of course, it makes the logistics much more complicated, but it's a beautiful exercise of our democracy. When you look back at that elections, how would you assess it from an IEC perspective?
Look, with each election, we must strive to do more, not for ourselves, but for the voting public. Last year was a once-in-a-lifetime democratic experience. For the first time, we had independent candidates contesting elections for the national and provincial legislatures. Out of that, it meant that we needed to do things differently. What do we mean by that? There was an introduction for the first time of a third ballot in those elections. It had its own difficulties. Secondly, with each election, the number of contestants increased. We had 77 unique contestants in that election, 70 from political parties and independent candidates for the first time. And what that meant is that we needed to be creative in how we design the ballot paper to make sure that the voters can still find a candidate or party of their choice on the ballot paper, to identify them with confidence and to make their mark with confidence without inadvertently miscasting that ballot. We also had, for the first time in a general election, a ballot paper that was laid out in two columns with parties on the left and parties on the right. With that, we were concerned that we'll see a spike in spoiled votes, but to our relief, in fact, the opposite happened. The rate of spoiled votes decreased with this election. So our level of communication, our level of voter education had to change to accommodate the new changed environment. It did not even help that the laws that underpinned that electoral process were passed very late in the process, and also added to that, we were still in courts 2 months before an election. So clarity was only obtained about 2 months before an election on the quantum of requirements that contestants needed to meet in order to participate in an election.
Masego, what was interesting about last year's elections is that I remember the Saturday, June the 1st, obviously it was deep into the night where you had various political parties, of course, making these claims of rigged elections or spoiled ballots. And this, of course, comes with the territory of that third ballot, which creates, obviously, this complexity within the elections and within our democracy. When you look back then, how does the IEC then prepare itself for local government elections, which of course will have, again, like that, 3 different ballots, which the South African public can go ahead and cast their vote. So when you look back to last year, what had happened during that time at the ROC, and how do you then prepare looking ahead to next year?
Look, the two elections are incomparable. Local government elections are infinitely more complicated. You have wards. In the last 2021 general elections of municipalities, we had 4,600 wards. What that means is that you have a unique ballot paper that can only be used in one ward.
Sure.
And the contestants on that ballot paper will never be the same. So the level of planning, the level of attention to detail has to be much more pronounced than in national and provincial election. Make sure that you can get a ward ballot in those various permutations at the correct ward, in correct quantities, at the correct time. The second part of your question, the law makes provision for those who are unhappy with the decisions or conduct of the commission to have recourse. There exists an electoral court, and in fairness to all the parties that were aggrieved by the decision of the commission, they went to the electoral court, they've had their matters ventilated, and judicial decisions were made. Those who were not happy with the decisions of the electoral court, in some instances, even took their matters all the way up to the Constitutional Court. The good thing with that is that in all of those cases, the soundness of the Commission's decisions, its adherence to the law were vindicated by the court. So challenges should not be seen only negatively. They are also a democracy building exercise to ensure that we do not operate above the law. We are still subject to the laws. So all that we could do is to ask contestants, if you are aggrieved with the decision, follow the processes and let the judicial process render an outcome.
Yeah, and I think that comes to the other question of logistics, because what's going to happen next year is just like you have, of course, the 9 different centers across the country. Many of them are going to have a keen eye on how the ballots are going to be counted. In the next segment, we are going to touch on, of course, on e-voting, which could or could not assist in making the counting much more easy and much more simpler. But then the fresh minds that are going to be needed for the counting of the votes, because I do remember last year, many had expected Saturday, the 1st of June, to be the actual announcement, but it had to be delayed 24 hours later, given that there are these third ballots that are in there. So how does then the IEC prepare itself to make sure that the various centers across South Africa are being, not just having a fresh mind, but making sure that they follow every electoral act which is prescribed in our constitution?
The good thing is that our lawgivers bequeathed to us one of the most robust electoral systems with checks and balances at every step. We have in excess of 23,000 voting stations. People vote at those stations. Once we've closed those stations, no ballot leaves the station until we've concluded a count. So at the 23,000 centers, we count there. We issue a result. If there's a need to recount, we recount there. We leave the result on the door of the voting station as a public announcement to say, these are the results that have been declared at this station. We transport another copy in tamper-evident bags to a local capturing site. Even there, political parties and contestants can maintain presence to say that what has left the station is what we capture. We also employ at huge cost independent auditors who audit not on a sample basis, but for each result slip, 3 result slips for voting station, each result slip audited and confirm that the math on that result slip make sense. The results are then imputed into a result system. Again, all political contestants have access to pull up a result slip and compare it to the result slip that they received from their party agent. So the robustness of the system is one of the strengths of this electoral commission.
After the break, I'll wrap up my conversation with Masego Sheburi from the IEC. We're going to be touching on e-voting, political party funding, and of course, the build-up to next year's local government elections. Do stay tuned. Welcome back to News in Focus. I'm still in conversation with Masego Sheburi, who serves as the Deputy CEO for the Independent Electoral Commission in terms of the electoral logistics. Masego, let's start on e-voting. I think it's been a huge topic. Of course, various stakeholders have been asked to come through to give their taking on how this should be done. I think one of the concerns is that when you go into the deeper rural parts of South Africa, because what we haven't seen is this migration from analog to digital, and this is not obviously with regards to the non-linear ways of viewing TV, but just the fact that internet is very difficult to find in so many rural areas. How does then the IEC, when a final decision is made with stakeholders, because as we heard in the press conference by Mr. Mamapolo, there's still a lot of discussions that are going to be taking place, but if the consensus is that e-voting is the way to go as one option, how does not just the education part come into it, but also accessibility part come for these voters to exercise this right of theirs?
E-voting and the technology that the country ultimately chooses must not be for the convenience of an election management body like ourselves, but it must be assessed on the basis of what it does for a voter.
Sure.
In other words, does it transcend the institutional difficulties our country faces of the digital divide, of unequal penetration of internet in communities? How does it enable a person with disabilities to vote without disclosing their choice? How does it transcend the divide of literate people and those who are illiterate? And how does it improve the confidence of the voter?
Sure.
So those are the things that the Commission went into this discussion with its mind wide open, knowing that whatever choice of technology, it must not worsen the divide in the country. That choice must be informed by participation of voters, because if you adopt e-voting without taking the country with you, you're going to have to reverse that decision, because if there's mistrust, people will not show up to vote, because how do you expect people to vote on a platform that they don't understand or that they trust? The second thing is whether e-voting will help drive up the rate of participation. Again, we know that people who do not intend to vote will not come up and vote only because there is e-voting. And lastly, what is the choice of technology? If you have an unequal society like ours, will internet-based voting be the solution? Absolutely not. And we know from having done studies internationally, there are technologies that may be suited to the South African condition. In other words, where you ask people to go to a voting station and you put the technology at the voting station, where those machines are not connected to anything, they do not transmit anything. So they are a localized solution that will help to give you a result immediately after you close the station. So people punch numbers on the screen. When you close the station, you press a button, it issues you a result. If there's doubt, you can go into the paper receipts in the box to recount. That could be one of the solutions that should be available to South Africa. But we are mindful that the Electoral Commission should not be left to take those important policy decisions on its own. We have a 6-month period where we are engaging with interested persons and stakeholders to help us also have answers to those difficult solutions, so that ultimately when we recommend solutions, we recommend solutions that speak to the South African condition.
I want to touch on voter education, especially amongst the youth, because that has always been one of the concerns of the country, but also something that the IEC has stressed. When you speak to the youth, a lot of their concerns are, well, my vote's not going to count, or whoever I vote for, they're not going to speak to the core issues. Many would say it is quite a rightful fact from them, and it's a concerning fact given the high number of unemployment, especially amongst the youth. But how does the IEC then play its role? And I know you've got only minimal part to play. It's also political parties, ourselves as the media, and society as a whole. But from an IEC perspective, to play its role in saying, the importance of your vote matters, because at the end of the day, this is you as a South African, this is you as a youngster exercising your right prescribed within the Constitution.
Indeed, if you consider that the youth constitute a third of the population in the country, but only 7.9 million of those are registered as voters. So they are a third of the population, but only 28% of the registered voters. So we know what militates against young persons participating. And I suspect it is time that we must start now to also change our messaging to say we're not speaking to young persons only as voters. We're also speaking to young persons as candidates. In other words, agents for the change that they want to see. That to say you must register as a voter in order to exercise your political rights to vote, but more importantly to make yourself available to stand as a candidate so that you become the agent of the change that you want to see, especially in local government election. A person can stand as a ward candidate or they could be nominated by a political party.
Masego, let's touch on political party funding. And I think, for those at home that maybe are not aware of it, there is an amount of per quarter close to 84 million rand that is allocated to each party, which is of course prescribed to Parliament, and of course that of the Electoral Act. And then of course you get the 100,000, which of course that needs to be declared. We've seen of course that in many occasions, especially in the lead up to last year's elections and post the elections. I know when we speak numbers, viewers at home or maybe the public at large would think, well, it's just numbers, political parties have the right to be funded by whoever they want to be funded. But the declaration part, how important is it? Because the public needs to know who's voting for these parties so that they can have a decision from their part as an individual to know who are they voting for and who are the donors of these political parties. From an IEC perspective, that knowledge is important, isn't it? Because it gives a clarification of who's funding who and how this money is being dispersed so that this declaration can be done.
Indeed, there are, just taking it a step back, there are a number of channels through which parties receive funding. The first one, which has been in our scheme of law since the beginning, since the democratic breakthrough, is the public funding of political parties. In other words, Parliament, voting funds that are disbursed through the IEC to registered political parties. Those funds can be used for certain purposes, they can't be used for other purposes. At the end of the financial year, all the parties must account for the money that comes from the public purse that has been dispersed to them. In this financial year, there's just over 300 million that the 20 political parties share on a quarterly basis. On a quarterly basis, we disperse an amount of 84 million rands to the 20 represented political parties. That's the easy part. The second part is that parties can receive donations from their members, from big business, from any person except a class of persons who are not allowed to donate to parties. Foreign government agencies or foreign government, as well as parties can't receive funding knowingly from proceeds of crime. So that is the area in which it is a new area where, and it's important because voters must know who funds political parties so that they can choose parties on an informed basis, to know if this party promotes these policy choices, what may be driving these policy choices. Are the party doing this because they received funds from this source also? So on those ones, the law requires a party to declare amounts that are in excess of 100,000. And the person making a donation must also declare if they donate to a party in excess of 100,000. Those donations are done on a quarterly basis, and at the end of a financial year, the party must have its books audited and an independent auditor to issue a financial statement of the income and expenditure of that political party. So 100,000 is a threshold from whence disclosures become permissible, and there's a limit of 15 million per annum that can be breached for funding to a political party.
Masego, one final question. I know I'm going to be having a lot of conversations at the IEC leading up to local government elections, but as we sit here, obviously towards the middle of 2025, I think a lot of the groundwork is going to be laid for this local government elections, and I think the public in itself, they would just want a smooth elections to happen. The road for the IEC is going to be that, isn't it? To make sure that come, whether it's November 2026 or December 2026 or January 2027, that when the day comes, that this road will have a smooth elections for the public to go ahead and conduct.
Indeed. We have begun the preparations. With each election, there's no fewer than 300 unique projects that we run. Those projects have been activated. Procurement have already started for a majority of requirements. And once we've received the ward boundaries from the OMDB, we'll finalize our delimitation set. That will be the basis of our voting stations for next year. We will have a general period to register voters, and thereafter, once the date of the election is formally announced, the voters' roll will close on that day, and we'll start the process of candidate nomination, which will culminate in an election when it is called, either in late 2026 or in Jan 2027. Just as a parting shot, in 2021 for the local government election, 100,000 candidates were nominated.
That's independent candidates, yeah?
Overall, yes. All candidates from parties and independents, ward and PR, to fill a finite number of 10,000 seats. So when the results were announced, you'd expect that only 10,000 people will be happy because they would be voted into seats. And the celebratory voices of those 10,000 people was drowned out by the 90,000 persons who thought they also equally stood a chance. So those are the figures that we're talking about. And we think this time around, the level of contestation will be even more. So our system must be such that they can withstand the rigor of those processes, including how we manage the result collation and ultimately the result announcements.
Masego Sheburi, thank you so much for making the time for us. Much appreciated. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you.
Okay, that's Masego Sheburi from the Independent Electoral Commission, a special broadcast here from the IEC House in Centurion, Tshwane. That's all we have for you here on News in Focus from myself, Fahraaz Patel, and the team that brought you this productions, Suleiman and welcome. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.